Welcome to SilviCast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we are both silviculturists with Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show. Brad! Hey, Brad! What are you doing?
Slash walls, Gregor. Building slash walls.
In your backyard?
Well, you got to do it someplace. So that one over there, it's protecting my new grapevines.
Uh-huh.
Remember I had that frost with damage last year?
Oh, yeah, you lost them. Yeah.
So that was a problem. And just when I get them through that, now I got to deal with deer. So no more. We're putting in slash walls.
Okay, but this is your backyard, and these things are like 10 feet high. I'm sure Mary is just thrilled with the look. And wouldn't just a fence have sufficed?
Penny wise, my friend, penny wise. This is much more cost effective. And you know what? This slash was free. All I had to do was out and get it. So,
yeah.
I'll smooth it over with Mary.
This all sounds familiar.
It'll be big.
I see. What's that slash wall that you're building over there now?
See that little circular one? That's around my bird feeder. Oh. And have you seen the price of bird feed recently? And hey, the squirrels are cleaning me out of house and home too.
Oh, Brad, the squirrels can climb.
All right, good point. I might have got a little carried away on that one. But, recently I was reading about how slash walls are used to protect regeneration harvests. Mm-hmm. You know what? I had to try them out. And I think every forester will agree we need more cost-effective ways to mitigate the impacts of deer browse on forest regeneration.
Well, that we do. I will agree. So, Mr. Hutnick, you can take the safety gear off and put the saw down, because today on SilviCast, we will be speaking with a fantastic group of foresters who have innovated the slash walls approach to deer browse protection. With us today is Peter Smallidge, the New York State Extension Forester, Brett Chedzoy, Regional Extension Forester at Cornell, and our very own Jason Hennes, Forest Ranger for the Wisconsin DNR.
Excellent. Greg, I'll be right there. I just got to plug one last hole in this wall.
Well, Brad is working on that. Folks, we'll be right back. All right, Peter, Brett, Jason, welcome to SilviCast. I know I'm really excited to have just a really great group of people who practice silviculture in the field. And so I'm excited for this conversation. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to it.
Greg, I don't know about you, but it's really exciting seeing a big group on SilviCast like this.
Yeah, this is like a little bigger than we normally have. So I'm a little bit nervous, just kind of lots of different things going on at once. But don't worry. I was going to say, this is not a business meeting. It's more like a conversation at the bar, although we're not at the bar. So
we can amend it, Greg, if we need to. We could go get drinks, but maybe afterwards.
Yeah, maybe later.
Yeah.
So I think, though, we probably should be a little bit formal in terms of doing introductions, because everybody out there in the audience doesn't know who all of you are. So could you guys give just sort of a brief overview of who you are, where do you work, and what your job is? So maybe Jason, we'll start with you.
Well, hello, everybody. It's very nice to be here. My name is Jason Hennes. I am a Wisconsin DNR forester. Forest Ranger is my title, in central Wisconsin in Waupaca County, located at Hartman Creek State Park. I am responsible for state lands timber management on all of our state lands within Waupaca County, as well as forest fire suppression, prescribed burning, private forestry assistance with private landowners, as well as I'm a statewide resource. That's probably the 5-second mark, huh?
No, perfect.
And you are on fire duty, so yes. If you got to go, you got to go.
And I am on fire duty, so if I have to go and the pager goes off, well, I'm sorry, and I'll have to catch up with you guys in a bit.
Then we know what it was. Okay.
Yep.
How about you, Peter?
Hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here, to be invited. It's SilviCast seems like a great resource, and it's fun to be able to be part of that. So I'm Peter Smallidge. I work at Cornell University. My primary job is to serve as the state extension forester. So I work statewide with educational programming for woodlot owners and foresters and loggers. I'm involved in applied research, and the two general areas where I've done research include how to kill trees, so managing American beech and invasive shrubs and other interfering species, but also how to regrow forests and grow trees. So those are like kill trees, grow trees. And I serve, as part of my duties, I serve as the director of Cornell's Arnott Teaching and Research Forest, which is a 42, almost 4,300 acre managed forest that uses a demonstration of how to practice forestry.
And I know probably a number of our listeners are familiar with you, Peter, from your Forest Connect webinars, because I know I listen to a lot of them.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So every month on the third Wednesday of the month, we have the Forest Connect webinar series. Forest Connect's the program that a lot of us through the Cornell system contribute to, and that's a kind of a flagship effort that we have a lot of fun with. So thank you.
Peter, I really enjoy those. And I think a lot of times I listen to them just to spur thought, like, oh, I never thought about that. Maybe I should try something like that. And I think that leads to part of our topic today too. So that's fantastic.
How about you, Brett?
I'm Brett Chedzoy. I've worked for the past 15 years with Peter regionally as an extension forester. I'm employed by Cornell Cooperative Extension in Schuyler County, New York. We're New York's smallest upstate county. And for the past 7 years, I've worked part-time as the forest manager at Cornell's Arnott Teaching Research Forest.
Yeah, and we're going to probably talk a little bit about the Arnott and some of the work that's been done there. So that's cool.
I think today, it's really interesting, Greg. We've been known to talk a little bit about deer on SilviCast, and definitely after SilviCast, or in the
foresters
woods.
Never talk about deer, right?
Yeah, we never talk about deer. We don't have any opinions on deer. But when we actually admit that we do, we're always looking for answers, always looking for ways we can do things. And Peter, you mentioned kind of the Forestry Connect, and in 2020, you guys did a really interesting webinar on slash walls that I think at least lit the fire with me, kind of made me start thinking, hey, this is something we should really start thinking about. So maybe it's a really good place to start. So what are slash walls?
Okay. So it's interesting talking about foresters talking about deer. Probably the only other thing that gets as much conversation is finding good markets, right?
Yeah, that's right.
The slash walls were something that Brett and I developed, at least to our knowledge, at the Arnott Forest, and it was really trying to find a practical solution to a problem that had challenged us for more than a decade, and we were finding that deer, every time we tried to do a regeneration harvest, we do what seemed like textbook perfect silviculture, different kinds of regeneration systems, harvesting systems, and we kept growing back everything but the desirable commercial species that we wanted. And we had, back in the late 90s, the Arnott Forest had worked with some colleagues that were kind of a wildlife deer biology group, and we had started an earn a buck hunting program. So we required hunters to shoot 2 does before they were eligible to shoot a buck. We tripled the harvest of deer on the Arnott, and we still didn't. Even 15 years later, it had no meaningful effect on how we could regenerate the forest. And around the state, there was a lot of conversation about, well, we need to increase the deer hunter effort. We need to, all these kind of the lethal side of how do you manage the deer herd. And, people are talking about we need to bring in wolves and bring in cougars and mountain lions and all of this, whether those things work, there were decades into the future working through the bureaucracy of the New York system. New York, I don't think New York's unique in that. So Brett and I were just challenged with, well, we need to manage a forest. We're trying to do things as part of the land grant role to demonstrate to people how to practice forestry. We knew that forests were regeneration harvests were happening in New York, in the Northeast, and throughout the everywhere. And so we had to come up with a practical solution. And so we started off with this idea of, well, what if we accumulate logging debris, and low-grade material around the perimeter of a harvest in a sufficient volume that it would keep the deer out. And it was our way to try to get away from the use of the word hope as part of a silvicultural prescription. It just, it seemed like we wanted to be able to call the shots a little bit better. And so we launched into it, and Brett did all the, the really hard work of really bringing the idea together and making it crystallize as something that would actually be practical, and finding some loggers that would make it happen on the ground.
So Brett, you initiated that first trial at the Arnott, is that correct?
Yes, we attempted our first slash wall in 2017.
So what did that look like? I mean, how did you go about constructing that, and what did that experience look like?
We started the conversation about a year earlier with a local logging contractor who had been working at the Arnott Forest for over 20 years, doing a lot of research related harvests. So he was accustomed to trying new things and doing things that weren't necessarily standard operating procedure in a timber harvest. And he also was a contractor that had a gravel and excavation business. So our first vision for building slash walls was to bring slash from inside the harvest area over to the perimeter and then stack it with something. And we didn't quite know what the stacking part was going to look like. Consequently, we leaned towards this particular contractor because he offered to put an excavator with a thumb on the job and use that to build the wall. And since then, we've seen walls built a lot of different ways. They all seem to be working well. And we've found that, it doesn't take one specialized machine. Most of our walls to date have been built with a feller puncher, just basically throwing and piling slash.
I know when I watched the webinar, I was really surprised at the size of your walls. Like, what were the specifications that you kind of initially thought about?
When we put together our first contract, we thought it was important to have both a qualitative and a quantitative criteria in the contract. And we had no idea if the lawyers that we work with on the Cornell campus would buy into it. But our first contract said that the walls had to be built at least 10 feet high, 10 feet wide, and be sufficiently dense to exclude deer, as determined by me, the forest manager. And the contract was approved. The contractor felt comfortable with that contractual language. We have since modified our contract to say that the walls need to be built to a target height, which is still 10 feet, but 10 feet to a 2-inch diameter branch. And since freestanding 10-foot walls tend to be 20-foot wide, we just say that they have to be 20 feet wide. We're not out there measuring wall width as they're being built. The sufficiently dense to exclude deer, that's still in there, and that just gives us a little bit of leverage to look at a wall and say, hey guys, the height's fine, but you left a big hole in the bottom.
How quickly does that go when using a contractor, or in your experience, how quickly can you put together a wall like that?
So surprisingly fast. The first contractors that built walls for us went through, I would say, a little bit of a learning curve, but they definitely became more efficient after the first few hundred feet, and really went about building walls differently than what Peter and I had originally envisioned. We thought that initially the trees would be directionally felled into a kind of a center line and then pushed up with whatever was available. And the contractors that built the first successful slash wall at the Arnott Forest, it's a mechanized Amish logging crew called Zook's Logging near Corning, New York. They had a large feller buncher and some grapple skidders. The way they went about building this was to basically make a dense foundation of more pole type timber that they could sort of lay in and make something that deer wouldn't be able to tunnel underneath. Even because if you think about just putting tree crowns or coarse slash on top of the ground, once the leaves and small twigs are gone, there's a lot of daylight through there. So they would take the kind of the submersible poles, lay that in a windrow, and then achieve the height by putting the coarser, fluffier stuff on top.
That's pretty ingenious.
And that was all credit to the loggers, because all we did was say, here's a contract and here's a harvest, build us a slash wall. And I remember getting them started and coming back a few days later, and they had already built probably 1,200 feet of slash wall at that point. And it looked great. It looked, I think, better than what we could have imagined. And as time went on, they just learned more and more little tricks. And I wouldn't say that there was any great revelation or great secret as to how to do this. And since then, Peter and I have seen a number of other slash walls built in other states, and each contractor seems to kind of invent his own method to doing it. And the ones we've talked to all seem, I would say, actually surprisingly content and excited about the slash walls.
It's probably worth noting that the label slash wall is a bit, I don't know, misnomer maybe, because it's slash, but it's also other low value, poor market opportunity material that goes in there. And it's once you commit to building the wall, you can't have a 99% wall. And so anything that however the contractors is sourcing the material for the wall, unless it's high-end timber, the wall is the highest priority, and it's essential that gets built in a way that it's going to be successful. My sense is the deer just kind of wander around on the outside, and they're always looking for some passageway. And if they're given an opportunity, then they'll squeeze through. I mean, they could probably jump over if they needed to, under duress, but they're more than happy to crawl through it. And that was the only failure that we had in those early walls, was a tree, coarse hemlock with large branches kind of suspended the stem off the ground. And when the needles had dropped away, the deer figured it out. So we plugged that and solved the problem.
Yeah, I imagine it's kind of like a fence. They can always find the hole.
Yes.
And I know both of you have kept careful records on that. Do you have any kind of estimate on how fast that, or what the rate of construction is of that wall? Or does that depend on lots of circumstances?
Yes and yes. So the averages are the easy numbers, and the loggers in the first year, the 2017 year, we did 4 harvests, and the loggers kept track of machine hours, and then we used GPS equipment to measure the lengths of the walls. And the estimate was, it worked out to be about 2 feet per minute for constructing the walls. Then we had another round of slash walls that got started in 2019, and we did some time motion studies. We had a technician that was keeping track of building the walls, and it worked out to be, I think, something like just over 2.2 minutes or 2.2 feet per minute. So it's just slightly faster. So we're pretty comfortable with this rule of thumb of 2 feet per minute, which is pretty amazing when you think about how fast they can build the walls.
And does that translate into a certain cost? Because I know a lot of people will be interested in, what's the cost to that relative to other forms of keeping the deer out?
So the cost, when you work backwards from the machine hour cost, it works out on an average to be about $1.50 a foot for the machine costs. And the variation in that first year ranged between about 90 cents a foot up to over $3 a foot. And the primary variable that determined where we had that fluctuation in cost was for topography. So on really steep topography, the machines were less able to function. The other factor was where there was insufficient amounts of slash or particularly low grade material, and they had to move around more. That was highlighted in an area that we've since named the wedge harvest, which was about a 9-acre harvest, and it was essentially a triangular shaped piece. And what the loggers pointed out to us is as you're building one wall approaching a corner, you're depleting all of the low grade material that you need when you come back.
Right.
Yeah. Particularly as as the three corners, they're going to be all acute angles. And so as you're coming back on that second side, you don't have anything to work with. So they were traveling a lot more. And so a lot more machine hours to go into building those. So we've learned no acute angles, as circular as possible, and kind of or big sweeping arches.
Yeah. Or narrow fingers would be the same.
Right.
Problem.
Oh, yeah. That wouldn't be good.
So here in Wisconsin, I think in the lake states, we always hear about deer management in the east, where you guys have to resort to deer fences. Because around here we get them, we use them, but they're not nearly, I think, as common as maybe in where you work. So how does a slash wall, like at that 90 cents or 90 cents to $3 a foot, or that $1.50 average, how does that compare to the alternatives like deer fencing or other methods?
So deer fencing costs are surprisingly elusive for us to find, because that was like our big question as we're thinking about how to talk with foresters about this as a strategy that they may want to consider. The best numbers we can come up with, one was we built a fence around a sugar bush that we harvested, only because, well, for two reasons. One, it had been thinned repeatedly over time, so we were kind of short on low grade inside the sugar bush, and also it was in an area that we could pretty easily get around it to check the integrity of the fence. And that cost us, so we did all the internal construction costs, and it worked out to be $4.50 a foot just for the install, for the labor and the materials for the install. Other numbers that we've heard for install go up as high as $6 or $7 a foot. And this is assuming that you're using low value trees that you retain around the perimeter to attach the fence to. When you start bringing in fence posts, the costs would go up. And we had initially, when Brett and I were talking in 2016 about a regeneration harvest, and we thought, all right, well, we got to manage the deer. We're going to bite the bullet. We're going to build a fence. And Brett, was spending time trying to locate trees on the perimeter of about a 60-acre harvest that was somewhere on the order of 7,000 feet of perimeter. And, one of those days was like a windy day, and we're standing out there watching tree branches fall. And we're thinking, this is a non-starter. You're talking to the entirety of the forestry crew at the Arnott Forest, and neither of us have time to go out in the woods and check damage to trees. And we've since talked to foresters, especially out of Pennsylvania, where they do a lot of deer fencing, and they bemoan the cost of having to check, inspect, go in and repair those fences. We'd done a kind of an email survey casting about to try and find foresters with experience. I think we got some feedback from foresters in Wisconsin or the lake states and I don't remember the actual cost, but it's the installation cost is a small part of a fence. Maintaining that fence, checking it every 2 weeks or maybe every month or more frequently than that is a very labor intensive, costly effort. So the 30-acre fence that we have around the sugar bush, we check every 2 weeks. And I know the first year that we did that, out of 52 weeks, we checked it weekly the first year, and out of 52 weeks or roughly whatever, it was about 40 occasions where we had to go in and do some kind of a repair just because of.
Wow.
But keep in mind, in that area, that was not a regeneration harvest, truly a regeneration harvest. We had fairly high residual stocking,
Yeah.
And so and it was an older sugar bush. So it was, you could design it so that you wouldn't have quite as many opportunity branches, dangling over the top of your fence. But it still is, there's a big cost there.
Yeah. You don't think about that cost. A lot of times you just look at that, linear foot cost initially. That's pretty amazing.
There's another downside to fences that I haven't heard talked about that much, and that is if and when your fence fails, and I would say it's more of a question of when, at some point during the regeneration phase, and deer get in there, can you even get them out at that point? And what we've seen in our slash walls is that by about the end of the first growing season, it is such a jungle inside that if it's like maybe a 5 or 10 acre harvest, you could potentially chase the deer back out of there or hunt them back out of there. But our larger slash walls, and our largest walls right now are, we have a 150 acre wall and a 160 acre wall. After 2 or 3 growing seasons, it's like head high, impenetrable thickets of vegetation in there. And if deer get in, good luck trying to get them out. So I would be very nervous about building a fence that I know it's just a matter of time before something flattens it. And in the days or weeks that it may take before I find that and repair that, deer will get in, and I'm just not going to get them out at that point.
Jason, I see on the screen that you have experience with some of this stuff. And so just like bringing us over to the Wisconsin side of things, how did you get into slash wall work here?
So Peter, Brett, what you guys are talking about is exactly what got me thinking about slash walls. You talk about the high deer numbers, the browse, the amount of trees that a single deer will eat is unbelievable. And in fact, a lot of people in the public don't believe it. I had a wildlife biologist the other day while he was picking up his tree seedlings actually telling me it wasn't deer, it was rabbits that are eating all of our trees.
Them too.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So what you guys are talking about with the fences, I'm sitting here listening to, and I'm just shaking my head in agreements because everything you're saying is like, yes, that's the exact same thing we've been experiencing here. The local staff here at the office, they've been putting up fences in Waupaca County for about the last 10 years now, and we're seeing the exact same thing. We haven't been able to grow trees, nice northern hardwood species. But what I got thinking was these fences take so much maintenance and time and effort and energy. Why don't we try something that really won't take that much maintenance after it's installed? So as an equipment operator for the DNR, I had a recent timber sale done. We have our bulldozer units are 450 John Deeres, and they're about 100 horse bulldozers. We have some root rakes that we attach to the front of the blades, and I thought, why don't I just start piling up some residual slash on this site, and I'll make some exclosures. I wasn't really sure on what specs that I wanted for the site, but I thought, well, I want to shoot for 6 to 8 feet high. That's how tall our fences are. And I want it wide because a deer can jump 6 to 8 feet. But I also recognize that deer are relatively lazy, and they're not going to want to walk through anything that's difficult. I laid out a couple areas and I flagged them, and I started pushing slash together, and turned out that you guys were doing the exact same thing over there about a year prior. So it was really fascinating when Brad and Greg said, hey, we should think about this. And it's like, oh, well, that's neat. You guys are doing it out there already. So that's kind of what got me into it, is just the recognition that our kids and grandkids aren't going to have a forest if we don't try to eliminate the deer from the equation.
And maybe one of the questions that's kind of cool then, if you think about your experience and we think about that, the New York experience, is maybe it's the really big question sitting underneath it. Like, does this work? So what's the experience that you guys have with that?
We're all familiar, of course, with the controversy of trying to reduce deer numbers. So slash walls basically circumvent the conversation. All we're doing is keeping deer out for a period of time. It could be as little as 5 years. It may be as long as 15 years or more, depending on what your starting conditions are and what the vegetative response is. We think of it as roughly a 10-year process to get that advanced regeneration above the browse height of deer. And then the slash walls gradually decompose in place. These are not removed. That's a commonly asked question. Well, what do you do with slash walls? Well, it sits out there and rots away. And meanwhile, all the other wildlife enjoys that, calls it home, and eventually the deer will go back in and reclaim that habitat. But it's really eye-opening when you see what grows inside these exclosures in the absence of deer. And I'm not here, by the way, today to knock the idea of building fences, but I think that slash walls have a lot of advantages. There's a time and place for what fences when we simply don't have enough slash. And Peter and I have come to realize that basically people that have been doing really good forestry over the years are kind of penalized in this because they may have already removed a lot of that low-grade timber that would have been useful for building a slash wall. And I think that there's some creative ways to kind of work around that. And we're still experimenting to see, well, just how small can the wall be and still be effective in keeping deer out for a sufficient amount of time. But when we talk about the costs, the maintenance, the risks of failure, I think slash walls are simply superior in all of those regards.
Brad, you'd asked about do they work and how do we know that they work? And I'll answer that, but there's a earlier comment when you were talking about, made me think of the range of costs of those slash walls from about 90 cents a foot up to over $3 a foot. And we work with the average of $1.50 is what we compensate our loggers for. And the $3 a foot would be a kind of a scary endpoint. And so what Brett has done is, and we have the flexibility on over 4,000 acres when we lay out a harvest, we can adjust the location of the perimeter. And it allows us to be a little bit flexible and saying, okay, well, we can avoid some steep topography. We can put the perimeter in an area where we know we have adequate low grade and adequate access to slash. And so we can contain those costs and keep it closer to that $1.50 or less per foot of construction. The validating whether or not the walls worked was our first order of business, though, is we set out, we said, all right, the first question is, can loggers build a slash wall? And so, Brett charged the logging crew and the contract stipulated it and said, here's what we need you to do. Loggers are a creative bunch and just kind of like give them an end point and get out of the way, make sure they know what the expectations are, and they'll find a way to deliver on that. And we've seen that. Brett and I have visited a handful of slash walls throughout New England, and everyone has been done differently, and they've all looked great. So that's pretty neat. The second question was, do they work, and how do we know if they're going to keep the deer out? And we used 3 different strategies to validate the absence of deer inside slash walls. One of them, kind of a very low-tech way, was we went in the wintertime and walked around and looked for deer tracks in the snow. Same thing after you get some rain, or in the spring when the ground is soft, the deer would be walking on skid trails. And so we would go in and we would look for deer, simply just walk around and look for deer tracks. We didn't see any. The second thing that we did was a little more high tech, was we had a series of cameras, motion sensitive cameras that we mounted at some various locations. We started off using with appropriate permissions from the state wildlife agency, using baited camera stations inside the slash wall. We got great pictures of turkeys and raccoons and possums and everything else that enjoyed the corn. No pictures of deer, and we ended up, just because of the effort of trying to move corn into the center of these harvests, we just located the cameras at the gates, and just to keep track of whether, because there was essentially 1 or 2 visual openings in the slash walls that we had protected with the poly mesh fencing. the deer would walk around, they'd stand there and they'd look through. And so if we had a deer on the inside, they'd look out, and a deer on the outside would look in. And so the cameras just to the gates were sufficient. We were able to document the absence of deer with those cameras. The third thing was kind of the proof is in the pudding test. And we worked with a protocol that we had developed, some colleagues of ours, and we had developed called AVID, Assessing the Vegetation Impacts of Deer. We have a website, it's aviddeer.com. And just to kind of give a very simple explanation of that, you go in, you locate half a dozen 6-foot radius plots, tag a handful, 4 or 5 seedlings of the same species. On each of those plots, you want about 25 or 30 stems of each species, and you can have multiple species scattered in these plots. And then you measure the height of the seedling every year. And if the deer are browsing the seedlings, they don't grow taller. If they're not browsing the seedlings, they do grow taller. So we had a series of these arrays of avid plots inside the slash wall and outside the slash wall. And we were able to document that, yes, there is a deer problem on the outside, because just like Jason was pointing out, some people don't want to believe that the deer actually eat trees. And then on the inside, we were able to document that the seedlings were growing much taller and at a faster rate, gaining that height. So from that, we concluded that the slash walls were effective.
I'd like to echo what Peter just said. Very primitive way of checking. Do they keep deer out? Check in the winter months. Where are the tracks? Right. My biggest slash wall I had this in 2019. Take a walk in the wintertime, shin knee deep snow, and there's deer tracks all over the place. And I found one set that actually made it inside the barrier somehow. I don't know how, but you could see they looked on the edge for quite a bit to get out. And that track disappeared after the next snow, and they didn't go back in. And what's nice with that is I flagged where the track went in, and then I added more slash to it the following growing season. So it was really nice. But yeah, low maintenance. And like Brett said, they decompose over time. So it's an investment to put them in initially, but what is that investment return? That's an entire new generation of trees.
And are you seeing positive results also, Jason, in terms of height growth on seedlings?
I'm seeing what I would expect to see for results, and yes, it's working. Brad can attest. He was out on one of my sites, and within the barrier, 2 or 3 years after harvest with aspen, fast-growing species, of course, but we've historically not been able to regenerate small aspen areas because of the deer numbers. We've got 10, 12-foot aspen inside the barrier, outside hardly anything. Mm-hmm. And that was going for a lot of different tree species. So it's definitely effective at keeping the deer out long enough to establish aspen relatively quick. And the oak walls, I guess the oak areas that I have walled around, they're working as well. And tie that barrier construction in with scarification. And the use of what I did with the root rake and the bulldozer is I'm exposing bare mineral soil during a great acorn drop for white oak on this particular site. And we've got oak coming up as well. So it is kind of a dual purpose, and it worked really well.
You make an interesting point about the differences in species. And I know, Brett, you were thinking you needed to have about a 10-year regeneration period for those walls in the hardwoods. But then in Jason's aspen, he doesn't need that long. So maybe those wall specs almost could vary too by species, on how long you need it to last. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Sure. One thing while we're on this topic, so we've been doing many different measurements, both inside the walls in terms of regeneration and on the walls themselves. And one thing we have noticed, and I think it depends in part on the construction method. So I'm looking at the screen background and Jason there with his bulldozer walls. Now that wall is going to be fairly dense and have a lot of material packed into it. Mm-hmm. Our walls are, I would say, more porous and lower density because the slash is being essentially thrown into the wall and allowed to just pile up on itself. And we are seeing, I wouldn't call it significant slumping, but we are seeing slumping in our walls, roughly 8 to 10% a year. Peter can give you the exact facts and figures on that. So if you're starting with a 10-foot wall and it's slumping, let's just say 10% a year for the first few years, after several growing seasons, now you're down to possibly a 6 or 7-foot wall. Now you're starting to get to a wall height that deer could potentially see over the top. But when you see these older walls, you realize that there's a lot of other stuff that starts growing up in the wall, like blackberry canes and hardwood suckers and seedlings. What really is probably deterring the deer, besides the fact that they just lose that sense that that's a corridor for them to move through anymore, and they see that wall as like probably after the initial trauma of having their trails and movement patterns disrupted, I think deer just say, okay, that's an area where we don't walk through anymore. The other thing, though, is that deer are not going to probably try to breach that wall until they can easily walk over the top of it. So that wall is going to need to slump down to where it's within perhaps a couple feet of the ground. And that may change with heavy snowfall and crusted snow, but we've simply been targeting 10 years because we thought, like, okay, if we're doing everything else right and doing the necessary overlaying silvicultural treatments here, we ought to be able to pull this off in 10 years.
Yeah.
Timeline is, and I think, Brad, you're pointing out different species may have different timelines, but also different starting conditions. And Jason had the good fortune of a white oak acorn crop. The audience can't see it, but the picture that's behind me on the screen is a 25-acre harvest in predominantly red oak, and it coincided with an incredible acorn red oak seed deer, and that was completed in late 2019. 2019. So we've got the 2020 and 21 growing seasons, and we're talking about doing an overstory removal this year for the first time, just because we've got red oak that's between 2 and 3 feet tall. The residual basal area there was about 50 to 55 square feet, and so we're feeling like it's timely. We have great stocking, from we have a research regeneration plots 1 per acre throughout these harvests, and so we're able to monitor what's going on. So that wall was a great wall, and we don't need it to last 10 years probably, but other walls, wanting as many years as we can possibly get.
I was going to tease Peter and say it's a terrible picture he put up of that oak shelter wood, because I took a picture in there in the fall. We had one of our annual field days out there, and it was basically waist high, 2-year-old waist high oak seedlings, just a solid carpet throughout the entire shelter wood.
Yeah. What a problem.
Greg, you asked about the species composition and what we use to make these walls for desired species regen. And Peter and Brett, you guys, I'm thinking the exact same thing that you guys are doing. And I've never talked or met to you guys in the past. So it's interesting. I'm on the same page as what you guys are at right now with all of this. And that was my thought process. If we've got a slower growing tree species, definitely you need to use some hardier material to build that wall. And then recognize that, like Brett said, it's going to slump over time, and build it up a little more so it does get above browse height by the time the deer are able to penetrate the wall and get in. So It's really nice to hear that my thoughts are you guys have done, and it confirms a lot. Thank you.
With that in mind, has it changed, like from the first walls you constructed until the most recent ones you've seen? Has the width and the height and the kind of the volume, has that changed in your mind as what you need based on what you're seeing for slumping and all the kind of the changes occurring in the walls?
So the initial specifications were, I don't remember how we came up with the 10-foot height as the initial spec, but it just seemed like a good number, right? So we went with 10 feet, and we said 10 feet wide, and Brett had said earlier that when you build something 10 feet tall, you need a bigger base. And so when we went in and repeatedly measured the same locations around these original walls, and we've continued to do that with subsequent walls. The first walls, the average height was 10.1 feet, and that was measured to any woody material that was part of that slash wall. So a little twig, quarter-inch diameter twig counted. And those were the walls that we were monitoring and measuring. They dropped at about 10% per year. And we felt like that for some of those walls where we needed more time, that might not give us the time. We also felt like there was a fair amount of variability. So the loggers weren't out there with measuring tapes. They were eyeballing it. And the average was good, but we saw some variability in how it was made. So in the most recent set of walls, we modified the contract to say that the 10 feet has to be measured to a stem that's at least 2 inches in diameter. So these are substantially taller walls. And we also had, and this was a trick we learned from a forester, New York forester, Kellen Murphy. He was working with a landowner that had been to one of our field tours and said, "Hey, I want to do that on my property," one of those early adopters. And he went out and had a logger come in and put a slash wall. Kellen Murphy is his forester, and Kellen went out with his paint gun and had a 10-foot pole and would put a spot of paint on the tree at 10 feet. Well, we weren't sure that we were good enough aims with a squirt paint gun to hit 10. I could imagine doing it and having like a line that would stretch anywhere from about 6 feet up to 14 feet somewhere on that tree and just confuse the loggers. So we had one of our research technicians take a paint roller on an extension paint pole, put some orange spray paint on the roller, then knowing the height of the extension pole could put an orange spot on trees around the perimeter. So about every half a chain or something. So it gave a target to the loggers. The loggers really liked that because then when they hit that mark, they knew that they were done and they didn't have to keep trying to find slash to get to wherever they thought they might be. Now, obviously there's variation and you stand in a dip or you stand on a hump, but visually, and we'll know here in a couple of months if the variability is reduced, but visually those walls look more uniform and certainly more robust.
And I know, Peter, I think I recall from your webinar the importance of width, as width being almost as important as the height. Is that something that you found?
Yes, we assume so. We're visualizing the slash wall, and particularly the kind of the pore. When we say porous, it's not porous like porous, but it's porous like you got a bunch of treetops packed together. And we think of that even as the wall slumps and drops in height, that it functions as like a cattle guard would out west. If you've been out west, you drive around, you got these cattle guards on roads that are at the same level as the road, but the cows aren't going to put their hooves down between those bars for fear of breaking the legs. So we're thinking that the deer would visualize, the prospects of trying to walk through this coarse slash, the fluffy stuff that we have on top, as being a pretty dangerous pursuit of theirs.
Yeah. And
even as it slumps, we have walls that are 4 or 5 feet now in height, but that's still taller, at least during the non-winter season. That's above the normal height of what deer can see over. So I don't think deer have our ability to look at a wall and say, "Hey, I bet there's seedlings on the other side of that. Let me find a way to get in." And as Brett was pointing out, at some point, as young deer come in, some of these walls now are 5 or 6 years old. The younger deer have never been there. And so there's no historic pattern. So, but I'm getting way too close to deer psychology, and that's not that's you can bring in a deer psychologist to correct our assumptions on a future SilviCast.
Deer psychology there's a certain level of silvicultural nerdiness that our audience has come to expect. So even just talking about slash porosity, I think we're already there. So
you should see if you can get Jordan Peterson to come on and dissect the deer's psyche.
Yeah. I'm curious, have you guys tried this with uneven age management? So like actually relatively small openings?
So we have talked about that a lot. It'd be a lot of fun to see if we could make it work. I know you've had Ralph Nyland, Dr. Nyland, as a presenter on SilviCast before, and we both are, have huge admiration for Ralph, and he's been a big proponent of uneven age management. I don't see a lot of uneven age management in deliberate uneven age management in New York in terms of trying to regulate stand structure. So when we've talked about it, I don't see where. So there's like two scales. So there would be the scale of the stand, putting a slash wall around the perimeter of the stand. That, which would probably, if you're going to do single tree selection, that's what you'd have to do. If you're using group selection, then you could potentially put slash walls around groups. And let me pause and go on a tangent here. No, we don't know. No, we haven't tried it, and no, we don't have an answer for this. So I'm speculating, and Brett's going to speculate here in a minute too. So, in trying to think about let's just keep it simple and say if uneven age single tree selection, put a slash wall around the outside of the stand. You have a cutting cycle that's every 12, 15, 20 years. By that time, that original slash wall has slumped to the point that it's probably ineffective. Now you go in for your second cutting cycle. I don't know where you're going to get your slash to, unless you had these kind of expanding concentric bands. In every cutting cycle, you built another ring around the stand, but you'd have to plan for that. So if you need 60 or 100 feet of slash material to build a wall, then you've got to have to work with a pretty large stand if you're going to do that. The other option would be group selection, where we've done some experimental walls that were 1 acre in size. We didn't have enough material in those, and 2 out of the 3 that we built, there was not enough material to build a 10-foot wall. We were building about a 6 or a 7-foot wall. But on 1 acre, that may be big enough because you're not occupying as much of the deer's home range. So they may be less inclined to try to get in. And those smaller walls, I'd have to go back and look at the data. I don't think we've had much deer activity, if any, inside those 1 acre walls that had less height. So, but the footprint on the wall is somewhere around, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the harvest area is in the wall. So if you have, let's just say it's, to make the math easy for me, is 10% of the harvest area. And on those smaller areas, then that harvest it is closer to that 10 or 12%. When we get up about 60 or 80 acres, then we're down to about 5% of the area. So if you're putting in small group selections and you're building walls, even if they're smaller, you're occupying a lot of the land base. And so at some point, depending upon your frequency of cutting cycles, you're going to run out of land area or you're going to run out of slash. So we would love to have somebody come up with an idea that said, hey, why don't you try this? Brett and I debate it in a very friendly way, but it's like, hey, would this work? And I don't know, but would this work? And so I'll say we haven't tried it yet because we haven't been confident that we've got something that's worth playing with. So Brett, how will you disagree with that? Or what would you offer differently?
The several 1 acre walls that we've built to date as an experiment where we tasked the loggers with taking everything but the grade inside the 1 acre circles and putting it in the wall. In some cases, they took the scrag too. And what we got out of it was about 2/3 of a wall. The height was okay, not quite as wide, not quite as dense. And I'm pretty confident in saying there's been we don't go up and look at those walls because they're pretty hard to reach, but I strongly doubt, to your point, Jason, about the aspen suckers, we took a group out there, I think at the end of the first growing season, to look at those walls, and there were aspen suckers that were like 10 feet tall inside them already. So, and if you're getting that kind of coppice or suckering, do you need a 10-foot wall? Because maybe so we're not quite ready to say what the lower limit is. And I think it very much depends on what you're starting with. And what your expected deer pressure is there. But we try to approach these from a worst case scenario, because to get the regeneration almost there in a 100-acre seed tree or shelter wood cut, and then the wall falls apart and it doesn't quite get past the deer, that was a lot of work and expense for nothing. And it's easy to go out and patch a little hole here and there. Going out and making extensive patches on a slash wall, I don't want to be in that situation. So the 1 acre walls, though, I think are probably, and that seems to be about the smallest that we can do and still have a significant wall. And that isn't, maybe that's almost more like an even age expanding gap type system. But I think it's a way to, especially when we're talking about the sun loving species like our oaks, I think it's a way of at least establishing multiple age classes across a larger stand or area.
Jason, I know you have obviously northern hardwoods in your area. Have you thought about these smaller openings?
Yeah, so just on that, what Brett was talking about triggered a question real quick, but I'll get to your question, Greg. Yes, so these smaller openings, as I've been doing my post-sale recon and walking through the acres that have been cut, I've noticed that where I get my regeneration is in those tops that are fluffy. They're kind of like those cattle guards that the deer don't want to walk in because it's uncomfortable, I would imagine, getting to that deer psychology, but it's more work for them to be in there. So with some sales that I have going on right now, my lowest limit for utilization on a couple sales is 8 inches. So I'm leaving everything that is smaller than 8 inches on site. And I'm not having the loggers lop all this down to a certain height. I'm leaving it basically fluff all over the place. I'm leaving this entire area as a thick layer of slash and other smaller merchantable material. And the thought there is that we should have seedlings coming up through all that that slash. And getting right to the small acreage experimenting, I'm going down that path right now, basically, and saying, if I've got some gaps within northern hardwoods, I plan on essentially caging those gaps and putting slash within those gaps. If we've got a little bigger areas, then I would be implementing a smaller wall, probably increasing the specs of that wall to hopefully have it in place for 7 to 8, maybe 10 years. And hearing what Peter and Brett are saying as far as slumping over the years, is it 8 to 10% a year? That gives me an idea of how high do I need them. And I mean, what you guys are saying is really, really fantastic. So yes, I will be putting in slash walls and slash barriers, and I don't even know what to call it if I'm just caging the entire area, a slash C.
Well,
to keep the deer out.
I think the term you used is right, is caging. So that's a technique that people have used for the use of slash in maybe a different format.
Yeah, I think it will work solely based on what I've seen as far as where do I get regeneration in a regen harvest with high deer numbers.
I'm really curious. So on SilviCast, we're always trying to plant seeds with our listeners, like, hey, this is something new or maybe something to think about. So hopefully today we've planted some seeds with listeners about, hey, maybe slash walls are something I could try. What would be some tips that you guys would give to foresters thinking about slash walls, but they've never done it before?
The first thing I would say is, what are you waiting for?
Yeah.
Experiment.
Yep.
And it's going to seem like a daunting task. And around here, when we were initially doing this and we had tour groups coming, we could hear a lot of grumbling in the crowd of like, oh, I could just see getting my logger to do this. They don't even like doing that. And that's not really been our experience at all. And these other foresters that have gone out and tried it, they basically had the benefit of maybe coming and seeing our slash walls once or just watching a webinar, and they shared the concept with their logging crews. And wrote up a contract that they felt gave them some leverage to get the project done. And as Peter pointed out earlier, the loggers can be very creative and good at problem solving. But one thing I would emphasize is that you need to work with a contractor that buys into this. Now, how you come up with finding that contractor, I don't have an easy answer to that one. But if you cannot possibly inspect a slash wall into compliance, it's going to be really challenging to do if you have to show up every few days and go walk the perimeter of some big rugged harvest and try to measure and say, oh, you only build it to 9.5 feet instead of 10 feet or something like that. That's just, it's not going to work for anybody. So you need to have contractors there that are properly compensated and incentivized to do the job well and do it without needing to be there beating them over the head or twisting their arms. And Peter made the quip earlier about the wall has to be 100.0% completed. You can't go and have weak spots and holes here and there, because it only takes one little hole for deer to start tunneling in, and then things don't work out as planned. So work with good crews. And I think we all know who those crews are in our neighborhood. And if it's the guy that's going to be fighting you at every turn and looking to always cut corners, that's probably not your starting point for building your first slash walls.
Perfect. Everything Brett said. I would add just strategically, maybe tactically, if you're a landowner or an agency or an NGO, a land trust that likes the idea, but there's not necessarily a great reception, maybe as part of another harvest, do a small demonstration, set up a 5-acre slash wall, help the logger build confidence in the fact that they're able to do it. The logger's not on the hook to put up a slash wall around 100 acres and risk losing their shirt. But they shouldn't anyway, but just it allows them to kind of take a small bite, chew it, and prove to themselves that they can do it. And then you also have a working demonstration. So you can take other foresters out there. And once, we can talk about it, but until you stand there and see it, these are beautiful monolithic structures on the landscape. And it's delightful to stand there next to them and say, wow, this is going to work and it's going to keep deer out. And you can, and then you've got something to show them. And nobody was overly anxious about building a 5-acre slash wall or whatever, 7 acres, 3 acres.
That's a really good idea. We often advocate for piloting things. It's just people get comfortable with it.
I would echo both Peter and Brett there. Plan it out, do some foresight on it. Get that contractor that has the buy-in. I have a timber sale right now where I've discussed it with the contractor of what the plan is. I've given my leader's intent, task, purpose, and end state. I have taken paint and put it 10 feet up on some of those trees, say, this is where I want you to pile all that slash. And I don't want it super fluffy. I would like it somewhat dense. And they were going to biomass that area, but they bought into it. So they're going to leave that specific area and pile the slash. So having that foresight and the buy-in is huge. The other one, and for us, is public use of those sites, and its education and working with the land users and explaining the what and the why. But then if we have big areas and large slash walls, it's considering public use as well on our side, on the state side. And all right, do we install gates that people can still access this acreage and utilize for berry picking, bird watching, turkey hunting, whatever it might be? Probably not deer hunting. And if they have any deer within the barriers and the walls, great, shoot them during season, of course. But, allowing for public access, and how would we get into these if we need it? It sounds like you guys have some gates. That's perfect. But obviously stumps slow production.
We decided it was important to install some basic access gates because if not, curiosity might kill the cat if people are trying to climb over these. And when you stand next to them, it's like, oh, it doesn't look like such a big deal. And Peter and I both tried to climb over slash walls once, and I think we made it to the other side, but
Never again.
it was touch and go there. So
I'm
Yeah,
stuck.
it's sketchy. It's sketchy, even over 6 feet.
Yeah, the real fear is you drop your cell phone down inside the slash wall. It's like, how are we ever going to get that back?
So, as Brad said, if foresters are out there thinking about trying this, are there some resources? I think I know the answer to this, but some resources where they might be able to go online, for example, Peter, and look at maybe some of the slash wall information?
Yes, there are. So the two sources that we have, one is Brett and I created a blog site that's called slashwall.info, so singular on the wall, slashwall.info, and that's where we've started accumulating pictures and links to videos. We had a video that we worked through Cornell Cooperative Extension Media Services produced for us, so it's kind of a 5-minute quick how do you build a slash wall and some of the benefits of it. And then we've had at least one or a couple slash wall webinars that were hosted through the Forest Connect program. Those are on YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/Forest Connect and search for slash walls.
And we can put that information in the show notes too. So that'd be great.
Yes, and I've started making a list of some other things to add to the show notes. Brett and I are also on the verge of finishing a best management guide for slash walls. So it's kind of a talk you through or read your way through what we've learned. And I want to make sure I just kind of the tangent here. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to the loggers that we've worked with, to all of the people that have showed up at all of our field tours. We started with some ideas, but those have been enhanced many times over by the discussions that we've had by foresters that challenged us, or loggers that challenged us, or that encouraged us, or gave us new ways to look at things. So this is we're very much appreciative of all of the input that we've had. I guess the third thing that I would offer as a resource is Brett and I are we spend, like you all, we spend our lives answering email. And we're always happy if there's foresters or loggers out there and they're wondering, like, how do I do this? We're happy to jump on the phone, jump on a Zoom, answer emails, send pictures back and forth. So we're happy to do some kind of direct one-on-one cooperation.
I want to also credit, we have a couple great technicians that have been out there doing a huge amount of data collection. And it's because these are research projects, there's a lot of field hours out there measuring slash walls, measuring regeneration plots. One of our technicians, as we're chatting here this afternoon, keeps texting me about building gates in some of the new slash walls, and can he trim the edges and stuff? And it's like, you know the answer to that, Mike. Just trim the edges, do what you need to do.
And Jason, I think some of your experience is documented in the Great Lakes Silviculture Library, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct. I've been working with Brad and Colleen Matula on getting all of that stuff and that information into the Great Lakes Silvicultural Library. And so sounds like there's not a lot, but there's some resources out there for people if they're interested in it. And, anybody who's been working on this, myself, Brett, Peter, I think the more we do, the more people there will be to help spread the word and say that this is a good idea to address our regen problems. So, yeah. Well,
I really appreciate all of you coming on board to discuss this. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in this topic. It hasn't been used widely in Wisconsin, other than Jason that we know of. So I think there's going to be some folks really looking into it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This was a fantastic episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Jason. It's nice to meet you. Sounds like you're doing great work in Wisconsin. I'd love to see it at some point.
Likewise, I would love to come out to New York and see what you guys have going on. It was very nice meeting you guys.
All right. Well, you guys, thank you again. That was a great conversation today. One of the coolest things about silviculture, Brad, is creativity. People using their imaginations to solve problems.
My point exactly. You and Mary only see ugly piles of slash in the yard today, but after the slash walls have done their work, I only need to add some soil and some compost, and bada boom, bada bing, I've got some raised garden beds. The wonders of hugelkultur, Greg.
Oh, okay. I'm going to have to look that up.
It's going to be big. Well, thanks for listening to today's episode of SilviCast. Remember, continuing education credits are available for listening to SilviCast. Check out the SilviCast website for more information. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
And take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Haley Frater, our producer, Noah LeMade, IT Master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.